Hey guys, so I am so excited to finally be filming this video because it is in collaboration with CZ's World, which I cannot believe it's taken this long for us to actually make a collab video together. I'm sure you're all well aware of CZ's World already. He makes amazing, well thought out, well researched videos, and he just posted a complete Saw documentary, like an entire full-length documentary on the Saw franchise, so definitely go check that out. On my channel here today, he and I are going to be ranking all the Saw movies, and let me tell you, our lists are very different, so you'll definitely want to stay tuned through the entire video to hear all of our opinions, because I feel like a lot of people are very passionate about the Saw franchise and which movies are their favorites. And then in his video, we'll be ranking our top 5 Saw traps of all time. Also, there will be some spoilers for pretty much all of the Saw movies. We're going to be working from our least favorite all the way up to our favorites. So let's go ahead and have CZ's World start off this video with his least favorite Saw movie.
My number 9 Saw movie is going to be Saw 7. I prefer to call it that instead of Saw 3D. I'll start with what I did enjoy. I liked getting to see all the old faces in the Jigsaw support group. People like to criticize Bobby Dagan as a character, but I think there's something interesting about a man who pretended to be Jigsaw using his final game to test a man who pretended to be a Jigsaw victim. The finale is satisfying too. Hoffman's rampage is pretty BA, spotting all the old traps in the evidence room is nostalgic, and seeing who was under the pig mask all this time is one of my favorite reveals in the series. My problem with Saw 7 is there's no real sense of finality. It doesn't feel like a grand conclusion most of the time. It just feels like another Saw movie. This one also has super annoying characters. Saw is kind of known for having smart characters go up against other smart characters, but these characters are just typical horror movie idiots. The traps are also not that great in this. I mean, one of the traps is literally just a gun that shoots you. Oh, and when you die in this movie, you bleed pink blood. It just looks terrible. It also doesn't make a lot of sense to me that this is the only one with the dream scene. It's just not very Saw. So for me, the original finale was the most disappointing entry.
Now on to my least favorite Saw movie, Jigsaw from 2017. I'm just not a fan of this movie. To me, Jigsaw is just an unnecessary sequel, and a lot of franchises typically do this where they say, like in Saw 7, the final chapter, or Saw 3D, which we'll get to. So Jigsaw is actually the first movie in the entire franchise to divert from the original storyline. And I think that works for some people, and it kind of enticed a lot of new fans, I feel, but for the OG fans, I feel like some of us were highly disappointed in that. I know they were trying to do their own thing, and Spiral kind of does that as well, which again, I'll get to. But for me, I would prefer it to kind of stick with the original. I mean, it's kind of sticking with the original Saw storyline. It's complicated. Jigsaw is a complicated movie. But for me, the plot and storyline of Jigsaw just felt a little bit too disjointed from the Saw universe. So to me, it's not really a Saw movie, which I said that in a previous video. Did not know that was so controversial to say. I also didn't really enjoy the traps in Jigsaw because I felt like they were a little bit too complicated and unrealistic for me personally. As you'll see in the other video of my 5 favorite Saw traps, you'll see that I like and appreciate the simplicity of a lot of the traps. I don't like the over-the-top ones with the lasers and all of that. Like, to me, that takes me out of it and feels a little bit more action-y than like true horror and suspense. I appreciate the efforts and the attempt with Jigsaw to throw off the viewers with time jumps and things like that. I get it. I know what they were trying to go for, but for me, it just doesn't fit in the original timeline of the films, and for me, it's too disjointed, too convoluted. It's my least favorite.
My 8th favorite Saw movie is Saw 4. Now, I'll give this one props for setting up the rise of Mark Hoffman, who would become the next villain and one of the all-time greatest Saw characters. This was also where they made the decision to keep making Saw movies, but to stick with the original continuity. The franchise has never had a reboot or a remake, and I think we have Saw 4 to thank for that. However, in order to make this movie work in that continuity, it required a lot of retconning. And the last 2 films already kind of retcon certain events, and now we're retconning the retcons, and this movie just gets needlessly complicated and convoluted by trying to make John Kramer play a major part in it. I think Saw 3 was a great end to Kramer's story, and they probably could have just left it at that and shifted focus to someone new. This one takes place at the same time as Saw 3, but we don't fully realize that until the end, so a lot of what we see is just really confusing. Even when I watch it now, I have to remind myself about how the movie ends so I don't go crazy. The whole movie revolves around SWAT officer Rigg, who is essentially just being tested for doing his job, which is kinda lame, and the game at Gideon Meatpacking Plant is just not very fun compared to the games we've seen before this. The participants are essentially just stuck there, waiting for Rig to show up or not show up. Compare that to Adam and Dr. Gordon from Saw 1, who are actively tampering with the room and solving the puzzle. I'd much rather see characters that move the story forward. And you kind of feel bad for Matthews. It seems like he's redeemed himself at this point, but he's never given another chance to survive. Director Darren Lynn Bousman made this franchise what it is today, but I wouldn't consider Saw 4 to be one of his crowning achievements.
Some of Zach's rankings are very controversial in my opinion, and obviously we have very differing opinions here. So for my second to last least favorite movie is, of course, Saw 7. I think the only reason why Saw 7 is a little bit better than Jigsaw for me, which again is controversial in the Saw universe. A lot of Saw fans prefer Jigsaw, but objectively Saw 7 is one of the most disliked in the entire franchise, and rightfully so. It does have probably the largest singular joint trap, meaning the most number of participants or individuals involved in a single trap, not in a group setting where they have like individual traps. Does that make any sense? You know what I'm talking about? And that, of course, is the horsepower trap. This stars Chester Bennington, which is one of the reasons why it's a little bit above Jigsaw as well, and obviously it does kind of fit loosely into the universe, so it's a little bit closer to a traditional Saw movie for me.
Next on my list is Saw 5. This is kind of a middle-of-the-road Saw for me. I like the battle of wits between Hoffman and Special Agent Strahm. Strahm knows that Hoffman is Jigsaw, and Hoffman knows that he knows, but for Strahm, it becomes a matter of proving it before he finds himself as the next victim. This one's got some great traps, like the pendulum, the water cube, and even if the glass coffin at the end is one of the more unfair traps, I can't help but smile when I watch it. There's no denying that it's iconic. I also find it super satisfying to go back and see additional context given for what really happened in scenes from Saw 1, 2, and 3. And I'm also impressed that the movie can do this without cheating and changing what actually happens in those scenes. That being said, this is probably the only Saw where I find major continuity errors, particularly when Strahm finds the FBI's list of Jigsaw victims and we see who investigated each case, and they basically suggest that Hoffman and Fisk were on the Jigsaw case before Sing and Tapp, which really doesn't make sense. The main game in Saw 5 is the Fatal Five's trial. It's a good concept, but not as interesting to me as Agent Strahm's investigation into Hoffman and Hoffman's attempts to mislead the FBI. There is a Saw movie that's very similar, and in my opinion, rightfully focuses more on the investigation side of things, which is why I'm choosing it as my next pick.
So the next movie, third from last, is Spiral. Now, I enjoyed this movie, half of it. I was so disappointed with the first half. I thought for sure I was going to hate it, but then I loved where it went. I did not like the acting in this movie, I have to say, but I did really enjoy the twist. Again, like I said with Jigsaw, the storyline is a tad disjointed from the original Saw universe because it just kind of relies on the concept of a copycat Jigsaw, because as we know, the plot was pretty much wrapped up in Saw 3D or Saw 7 or Saw the Final Chapter, whatever you call it. And I just feel like it's a little bit of a cop-out and they just immediately write it off as a Jigsaw copycat. So I wish there was a little bit more. If they're gonna do something different and continue the Saw franchise, they just don't jump into that right away because it just feels unrealistic for the world. I don't know, that's just my opinion. And that's really the only connection for Spiral to fit into the Saw universe, really. So that's one of the reasons why it just wasn't my favorite in the franchise. I liked it and I would definitely rewatch it over Jigsaw and Saw 7. That's why it's third from last, but it's still third from last.
My sixth favorite Saw movie is the most recent one, Spiral. The nickname Jigsaw has always referred to a jigsaw puzzle piece, so it's nice to see the series embracing the mystery aspect. Even if this one was a little bit too predictable, it can still be fun to see exactly how all the clues fit together. Aesthetically, I appreciate how Spiral captures the feeling of Saw without making it look like it was made on a soundstage with no time and no budget, like the original 7 movies were. The story is told through flashbacks, and then flashing back again to those flashbacks to see a little bit more of what happened, which is just how the original Saw told its story. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only aspect inherited from the original Saw. It also steals the same twist ending. They try to make us believe that Detective Shank is dead when he's really not, just as we were led to believe that John Kramer was dead in the original movie. That idea was really only gonna work once. That being said, the way that the reveal played out was still kind of exhilarating. We'll see how this one holds up for me over the years. Now I know making Spiral a fresh start for the franchise is kind of the point, but I almost feel like it's a little bit too disconnected. It's almost unbelievable that there isn't even a mention of characters like Hoffman or Halloran, or any acknowledgement of what happened in Saw 7 or 8, outside of a short mention that the new killer is not the first copycat. We know it's most likely going to connect into the franchise later, but it would just be more satisfying if some of those seeds were planted here. Also, keep your rap music out of my Saw movies, and feel free to bring back the metal in Saw 10, please.
So it seems Zach and I kind of agree on Spiral being lower on the totem pole. Next up for me, Saw 5. So this is directed by David Hackle, who was actually the production designer for Saw 2 through 5. And this is one of the movies where Darren Lynn Bousman stepped down as director. He does this for 5, 6, and Saw 3D or Saw 7. And for me, I think it kind of shows because the quality does drop off a little bit at Saw 5. I don't want to give spoilers to my future, like my lists, but I think you can see where my list is going. The first 4 are the best in the franchise. But it also has another group trap, and I actually really enjoyed the group trap in Saw 5. I think it's really entertaining. And this is one of my favorite things about Saw 2 also, which is like a bigger group trap where people kind of are forced to work together. And I think that's a really original, unique idea.
Well, you made it to the top 5, and here I've got another modern Saw, Jigsaw. I didn't care for it that much at first, but this one's really grown on me every time I watch it. It honors the entire Saw franchise before it, including what is essentially a museum of previous Saw traps. But it also innovates and does something different by focusing on confession as a form of suffering, as opposed to just physical suffering. It also opens the door to new stories by introducing the idea of the online community known as Jigsaw Rules, a gathering of hobbyists and Jigsaw followers, one of which is Eleanor, who is the Saw universe's representation of serial killer enthusiasts. She's just one of many new characters that I really like, and I can't wait to see what other adventures are in store for her, Logan, and Detective Hunt. Jigsaw shows enough restraint to leave us with some unsolved mysteries, so it's a fun movie to talk about. It's also by far the most beautifully shot Saw. It was about time we see more of the Saw world outside of dingy cellars and rusty bathrooms, and having more modern, open locations works well in a world where the evil characters of old are dead, and the community has had nearly a decade to heal. That being said, the movie doesn't innovate as much as I'd like it to. The main game is basically just a repeat of the Fatal Five. My biggest issue with Jigsaw, though, is that the movie cheats. This is another example of a reused twist, making the ending too predictable. It takes the idea of what we are seeing actually happened in the past, which we already did in Saw 2. But in Saw 2, it makes sense, because we're seeing the story out of order because that's how the police officers are perceiving it on the monitors. In Jigsaw, there's no in-universe reason that it's done that way. It's just to trick the audience. They also put modern technology in scenes that take place in the past, which is also just there to trick the audience. But when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. If a little more thought went into it, this would have been the perfect reintroduction into the Saw world.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Next we have Saw 6, and Saw 5 and 6 for me are pretty on par with each other. They could be interchangeable in my ranking if I'm honest. And I think the only reason why at this point in time, rankings change all the time by the way, but for right now why Saw 6 is ranked a little bit higher than Saw 5 for me personally is simply because I like the traps better. But like I said, they're pretty much on par with each other, interchangeable.
Now we're getting down to the heavy hitters. My next pick is the original Saw. At this point, Saw is actually more of an outlier in the series. The main story all takes place in one room, which is essentially an escape room in which Adam and Dr. Gordon are required to do some puzzle solving to try to get out. I think the biggest missed opportunity in the series is the fact that Saw 2 is really the only sequel that kept this concept alive. The games in the later sequels are all more linear. You solve a trap, then move on to the next room where another trap is waiting. Saw 1's puzzle not only keeps the audience guessing, but highlights the intelligence and creativity of its characters. The score by Charlie Clouser is obviously iconic, and I think it's a big part of what makes the twist ending so good. I think it's also easy to overlook all of the conventions that Saw established for the franchise, from creepy pig costumes to messages left on tape recorders to the reliance on flashbacks to recontextualize everything going on in the present. Saw is a beloved horror classic at this point, but that's not to say it isn't without flaws. Primarily the acting. I love Leigh Whannell, but he's better suited as a writer, director, or even just a less conniving acting role like his character in the Insidious movies. Even Cary Elwes isn't flawless in this movie, and I like to think a lot of this has to do with the low budget, requiring the movie to be shot extremely fast, so there probably wasn't any flexibility in the schedule to allow for retakes. It's also probably better if you don't think too hard about this movie. You might find yourself frustrated in how Adam is never really given a fair chance to survive, which is actually retconned in Saw 3. Zepp works at a hospital, but he's more willing to trust Jigsaw to make him an antidote than, I don't know, one of the many doctors who works there. Things fit together nicely at the end, except for Donnie Greco, the man whose stomach was torn open when Amanda was asked to retrieve a key from his body. The harder you think about it, the more the story kind of falls apart. Not to mention, the narrative really gets sidetracked by flashbacks. I mean, you almost forget who the actual movie is about.
I'm honestly a little shocked that Zach rated the original Saw so low. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say it. Like I said before, we're now down to the first 4 movies and the top 4 movies for me. And it's really, really difficult to rank them because this ranking has changed the most over the years of which ones I gravitate more towards. They're all fantastic in their own ways. Some have better storylines, some have better subplots, some have better traps. So coming in at 4th place is, of course, Saw 4. Saw 4, to me, this is directed by Darren Lynn Bousman and written by Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, who went on to write 4 through 7, and this one is also written by Thomas Fenton. So for me, Saw 4 has hands down some of the best traps in the entire franchise. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler for CZ's World's video where I talk about my top 5 Saw traps. 2 of the 5 are from Saw 4. And although I think that the subplot and the storyline aren't as strong, that's why it's ranked 4th on my list, the traps are just some of the best. And that's really this movie's strong suit, I think.
Not many movie franchises can say that one of the best entries is in the 6th movie, but that's exactly what Kevin Greutert managed to do with Saw 6. What makes this one so brilliant is that it makes a statement about a real-world issue. The theme is all about health insurance, and the traps are not just physical torture devices, but they ask the participant to make a moral choice that's symbolic of the choices that insurance providers make every day. In the meantime, we continue to develop our remaining characters, further explore the past of Jigsaw and his allies, and the movie contains the best scene in the entire Saw franchise. And I'm not even talking about the carousel trap. I'm talking about the audio descramble scene. The FBI is unfiltering this audio tape that should contain the voice of whoever Jigsaw's new successor is. You can just see Hoffman's slow internal unraveling, because he knows his voice is on that tape. The agents drop bomb after bomb, essentially revealing that they already knew it was him. And when his voice is revealed, he uses the tools available to him in the room to miraculously take out all 3 agents before burning the whole place to the ground. My only cons when it comes to Saw 6 are more or less nitpicks. The whole idea that Agent Perez secretly survived after Saw 4 is not my favorite, and when it comes to the main game, I really like the parts with William Easton making his way through the rooms, but the parts with Brent and Tara Abbott, they're basically just in a cage waiting for something to happen. Also, the way John says piranha is super weird.
Piranha.
Next is Saw 3, so it seems like we're going in order. Also directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, which I think is like the most iconic Saw director, obviously next to James Wan, but we'll get there. Saw 3 is written by Lee Whannell and James Wan, and this was actually my favorite Saw movie for such a long time. After I saw it, I was like 100% that is the best one. And I'm really surprised that when I sat down to kind of rank the Saw movies now, it came in 3rd. Like, that's a huge shock for me. However, Saw 3 has probably my favorite subplot and sub-traps, if you will, in any of the Saw movies, and that is the grieving father, Jeff, who lost his son in a car accident. And of course, he faces a series of decisions or tests that test him on whether or not to attempt to save the people who were responsible or involved with the death of his child. And just like a sad, tragic story, and that's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite subplots, just because I thought it was really well thought out.
If the series ended with Saw 3, I mean, I'm glad it didn't, but it would have been a worthy conclusion to the story. The acting is generally pretty good, and the brutality is definitely kicked up a notch. I'm pretty sure this is where the series got its torture porn label, even though that's not really why people like Saw movies. The media kind of latched onto that one. Luckily, Saw 3 doesn't rely on gore to keep you interested, and one of the best traps, the pig vat, features more of an emotional kind of suffering, when Jeff is forced to burn his late son's possessions to retrieve a key that can save a man's life. We're in the 3rd movie, and Lee Whannell is still cranking out some really good twist endings. This particular one is the best kind of twist, the kind that recontextualizes the rest of the movie. It's also got some great special effects. The cranium surgery looks so cool. I mean, don't you just want to touch John's brain when you see it on screen, Sarah? Yeah, that's how real it looks. Despite that, the movie overall is not too easy on the eyes. Visually, it's pretty rough. At 2 hours, this is the longest Saw movie, meaning that they had just as long as usual to shoot an extra 30 minutes of content. I actually think the cinematographer David Armstrong did a good job given the circumstances. There's even an occasional random scene that looks amazing. I'm also not that crazy about the character of Jeff. He just kind of lets things happen to him, and it never feels like he's trying to outsmart or get ahead of Jigsaw. Unlike previous test subjects like Dr. Gordon, Hap, Matthews, and even Xavier. The fact that he's ultimately the one to finish off John doesn't sit perfectly with me. It would have been cool if John had actually met his match in intelligence. Other than that though, I think the way Amanda's arc ended was pretty great, and Saw 3, pretty hard to beat.
So my second place Saw movie is Saw, the original. I think a lot of people rank this one really high, well deserved. I'm surprised that Zach did not. I think a lot of people put this in first because it is the original and it is what started it all, and it is by far one of the most well done Saw movies, hands down. There's no debate about that. I think objectively it is the most well done. It's the most well acted, thought out, the twist, the traps, the storyline, the subplot, all of it is fantastic in the original. And of course, this is written and directed by James Wan and co-written and starring Leigh Whannell. And this is the only Saw movie that is directed by James Wan. But of course, the first 3 Saw movies all had Leigh Whannell in its production. So I feel like that is one of the reasons why they're so strong in the franchise. But I do think this is kind of a perfect Saw movie. And if I were to recommend any of the Saw movies to anyone, of course it would be the original. And I just think that there are stronger traps in the rest of the franchise than in the first one. I'm sorry, I have to say it. I feel like the first one, they really tested the waters on the trap situation and then saw the response, and then they got really creative with the rest of the traps in the franchise, and that's why it's in second place.
And my number 1 Saw movie of all time is, of course, the Scott Tibbs documentary. No, I'm kidding, it's Saw 2. My love for Saw 2 starts with Eric and Daniel Matthews. The movie takes time at the beginning to set up their strained relationship, but you can tell Eric wants to be a good father, so you're rooting for him to save his son. That's super important in making you emotionally invested in what happens. The Nerve Gas House is my favorite Saw game. It combines the individual traps seen before in flashbacks with the escape room concept of the first one. It feels like a mystery, and it allows the characters to be creative to solve it. I also really like the idea that there were different traps for different people, but they don't have to solve it that way. It's kind of like a Breath of the Wild shrine, where you can find alternate solutions if you're clever enough. And fan theory, I'm pretty sure they don't always solve these puzzles the way that Jigsaw intended. I said it before, but I'll say it again. I don't know why the escape room puzzle solving concept was never revisited in any Saw movies after this. Saw 2 was the first movie where we actually get to see Tobin Bell act. He just lays there in the first one, and he is awesome. But Jigsaw isn't even the only creepy character. Abby is just a creep, and Xavier is downright terrifying as a secondary antagonist. A lot of what we think of when we think of Saw today comes from Saw 2, from the opening traps to big games that take place in a group, to Jigsaw having apprentices who are in on it from the beginning. And it does this all without bending the conventions of the first one out of shape. We still have the creator of the game hiding in plain sight, X marks the spot, heck, we're still even in the same house where the bathroom from the first movie is located. The twist, when we find out that the Nerve Gas House game already happened and the police are just seeing playback, is brilliant, and it makes it so much fun to go back and rewatch the movie to see all the clues. Even with this being another low-budget movie, the stuff in John's workshop looks really well shot, the scene transitions are super creative, and the ending, with Amanda saying game over and just that cut to the credits screen with Mudvayne playing, is so satisfying. I don't have much to say as far as negatives for Saw 2. It does get a little tortury in this one, the furnace, the needle pit, but as long as the story is good, those things don't really take away from the movie for me. If it relied on those things, then it would be a different story. I guess it would have been cool to see it get a bigger budget after the success of the first one. Addison's death scene is kind of a lame duck here as well. Saw is definitely at its best with smart characters, and luckily, Saw 2 has several of them.
It seems that we agree on first place Saw movie. That is the same. Saw 2, of course. Again, objectively, one of the best Saw movies. This one is one I can rewatch over and over again. The plot flows, which is kind of a rarity in some of the Saw movies, I'm not gonna lie. The plot is usually not the strong suit in Saw movies, I'm sorry. So this was the first movie that was written and directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, which obviously he went on to do so many other Saw movies. And for me, Saw 2 just has such good traps. It has one of the best twists, I think, in the entire franchise. Obviously, the first movie has one of the better twists, but Saw 2 is definitely up there with the catching the viewer off guard. And there's a reason why Saw 2 is my most probably rewatched next to Saw 3, but Saw 2 is definitely up there and is now 100% in my #1 spot. So there you have it. There is CZ World's ranking of all the Saw movies and my ranking of all the Saw movies. Very different lists. We very much disagree on some things, but that's what makes the horror community so much fun. Make sure you go check out his video next on my top 5 favorite Saw traps of all time. Also, I'm very keen to know what his favorite Saw traps are. We have not compared notes on that one, and so it'll be very interesting to see if any of our traps overlap, if we like the same ones or if we like different ones. I feel like there's so many to pick from, so I'm really curious to see what he picks. But thank you so much to CZ's World. Make sure you go check out his videos and subscribe to his channel. I will have it linked in the description, and make sure you check out our collab video on his channel. Thank you so much for being a part of this video on my channel. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.